In the mid-90s, my brother, Jake, and I found ourselves in charge of a long-distance move. Jake had secured a job in Colorado, a far cry from our quiet town in the Northeast. There was a lot of logistics that came with the move. He had to move everything he owned, which, while it wasn't much, was enough to fill a small box truck. There was no way that he could mail it all, and his girlfriend was already at their new place with his car, so it came down to him and I driving to his new place in the U-Haul, and then they would drive me to the airport so that I could fly back home. Jake and I were super close, so I had no problem taking a few days to road trip halfway across the country to get my little bro settled into his future. We packed up the truck and hit the road with excitement and a bit of trepidation. After a couple of days of smooth sailing, we found ourselves on a rather barren stretch of highway, miles from the nearest city. I think we were in southern Nebraska or part of north-central Kansas, just driving down the highways that were completely empty, even in the middle of the day. It was here that I looked in the side view mirror and saw what looked like a rusted pickup truck trailing us. Initially, they were pretty far back, but after driving for a while, it really did feel like they were following us. And I was a bit uneasy about it for some reason. To lighten the mood, I turned to Jake and made a dumb joke. I commented, "Wouldn't it be insane if these were some Deliverance-style psychos trying to kill us?" We both laughed, appreciating the absurdity and the scary thoughts of that impossible scenario. He followed it up with the classic banjo tune, you know the one, strumming the air, and we both chuckled and moved on, focusing on the drive. Our laughter was short-lived, as I noted that this truck was actually pulling up on us at a faster rate. It got to the point that I couldn't really see it in the side view mirror anymore. And when I turned to mention this, we were both nudged forward by the bump of this truck hitting the back of our U-Haul. I shouted, "What the F?" and hit the hazard lights, expecting them to pull over so that we could look at the damage. Instead of pulling up behind us, or ahead of us, they stopped right next to us, blocking one of the lanes of the road. I glanced over out at the truck, and before I could even string together a thought, a gunshot rang out and the windshield shattered. I covered my face and cowered over. My brother did the same, and we both just sat there for a moment before we realized that the truck was starting to roll away from us. I opened my eyes and looked at the truck drive off, only to see a literal child, no older than 10 years old, hanging out the window and holding the gun. This kid was waving the gun at us, almost to say, "Hey, I shot you. Me, a 10-year-old. Have a great life." We just watched as the truck drove off, the visual playing until they were a solid mile down the road. Thankfully, neither of us were hit, but the windshield and the passenger side window were clearly hit by the round. Being the 90s, we didn't have a cell phone on us. So we drove to the next exit and down to the nearest gas station. We were miles away, and it was an agonizing drive. Jake tried to say that we should just pull up to someone's house and ask for help, but I mentioned that the welcome wagon to town just shot at us. So I didn't think talking to anyone living here was a very good idea. The whole drive to the station, we were thinking that they were going to come back and do it again or something. Thankfully, we got there without issue. It was a fun time trying to explain to the attendant that we were shot at and needed the police. They came, examined the truck, and said that it was probably nothing personal, and that they would try to find out who did it. They asked about the truck and we described it, but the officer kind of chewed on his pen and shook his head like, "Nope, don't know who that is." Surprise, surprise, we never heard anything more about the case. We got the truck to his new place, and we had to give the company the information on what happened, including the police report. Nothing makes you sound crazier than telling a U-Haul attendant in a decently sized city that you were shot at by a child in the middle of northern Kansas. The scariest thing about this whole event, other than the 10-year-old handling a gun like that, is that the whole thing was unprovoked. They followed us for a solid 45 minutes on the road, so this was most likely planned while they were driving behind us, and hitting us was pretty clearly to get us to pull over. This was by far the scariest thing to ever happen to me, and to this day, whenever I plan any trips anywhere, I make it a point to completely avoid the central US at all costs. Hey, Raven. Long-time lurker, first-time submitter. I never really thought that I would share this story with anyone, but figured that it would be a good one to get out there. This is pretty much the most terrifying thing that has happened in my life, and it's the only thing like this that I've ever experienced, thankfully. And this happened back whenever I was about 13 or 14, at some point in the early 90s. I had a buddy named Mason that I spent a lot of time with throughout my childhood. During summer break, I would stay over at his house, and he would stay at my house, and we were just the best of friends. So, when his dad mentioned that they were going on a camping trip for a week that year, and told me that he wanted me to ask my parents if I could come with them, I was more than excited to do so. Of course, my parents were all for it. They were more than happy to get me out of the house for a while. We got to where his dad had decided to set up camp. It was a campground that was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and really didn't have many people in it. I wouldn't say that it was completely remote. It had a convenience store at the entrance after all, but it was definitely on the outskirts of civilization. At least, more on the outskirts than I have been in my time on the planet up to that point. Being that age, I'd been pretty well kept in the boundaries of our small town, so all I really knew was suburban life. We were a few days into the trip when the event happened. We'd been enjoying everything that nature had to offer. Hiking, cooking on a campfire, and of course, telling each other scary little ghost stories. That morning, Alex and I had been up since right before the sun had come out, talking about what we wanted to do that day, and Alex mentioned that we should go to the lake and go fishing. We settled on that, and then we mentioned it to his dad. His dad said that he was pretty worn out from the previous day's hike, and said that he wanted to take it easy, but that we could go by ourselves, as long as we were back by noon. I had a watch, so I knew how long we had, and when we needed to head back. So we agreed. We got our fishing gear together, and I suggested that we take the quick hike up to the convenience store to get a soda first, so that we had something to drink. Alex was really eager to get down to the lake, so he said that he would take the fishing gear down, and told me to go get the drinks and meet him there. I agreed, and we went in separate directions. I got to the shop, bought what I wanted, and got some extra snacks while I was there, and then started making my way back towards the lake. I was pretty excited as I made my way back, thinking it was going to be a really fun morning, and that we were going to catch some really big fish. I got to our spot where we had planned on setting up our lines, and I was a bit surprised to see that Alex wasn't there. At first I kind of thought maybe he'd found a new spot for us along the shoreline or something, so I looked around and started walking around the lake calling out for him. After a few minutes of me calling out and him not responding, I started to get a bit concerned, thinking maybe something had happened to him. The more I looked for him, the more I started to feel this weird, unexplainable unease at the fact that he was nowhere to be seen. Then it occurred to me that he may have gone back to the camp for some reason, so I started my way back to where we were set up. A bit up the path, I started to hear what sounded like a groaning sound. It was low and filled with pain, and it sounded like whatever was making this sound was struggling. Considering how quiet it was out on that path, it was kind of unsettling. As I glanced around trying to see where it was coming from, it clicked. That groaning sound was Alex. Alex was in pain and struggling. I dropped the sodas and sprinted towards where I thought it was coming from. My breath hitched when I approached Alex. He was crumpled over on the ground with an unmistakable dark spot staining his gray shirt. It was blood. He was bleeding. And it was a lot. I knelt down to him to make sure he was still mostly conscious. I was a young teenager and this was the mid-90s. I didn't know what to do with this situation. I knew that I needed to get him help, but I didn't want to leave him in the underbrush bleeding like that. Being as early as it was, no one was out hiking the area yet, and I was starting to panic. I told him to stay there and that I would go get his dad. Which, thinking back, was kind of silly. He definitely wasn't going anywhere. I sprinted to the camp and I yelled for his dad. I explained to him that Alex was on the ground and that he was badly injured. And then I took him to where I'd found him. He told me to run to the convenience store and tell them to call 911 and that he would take care of Alex. Those minutes that I spent sprinting to that little store were mentally draining. I was pushing my legs as hard as I could, struggling to breathe, and my mind was racing over the fact that if I wasn't fast enough, Alex was going to die. I remember just praying to myself, begging any deity that would listen to not let him die, to give me enough time and strength to get to the store quick enough. I swear every second felt like minutes, and every minute like an hour as I made that fairly short run to that store. And trying to explain to the clerk what happened was difficult as I tried to catch my breath. I ended up just yelling, "Call 911!" which thankfully was enough to get him to spring into action. The ambulance got to us in record time. I had to direct them to our camping spot and then take them down the trail to where Alex's dad was holding him and pretty visibly sobbing. The park rangers also showed up to where this was happening, as well as the police, and I had to explain to them my side of the story, which wasn't exactly helpful. At one point, one of the paramedics mentioned that this was a stab wound, that this wasn't just a natural laceration, that this was done intentionally with a blade of some sort. That's about the time where things kind of came together for me. He was stabbed. Our fishing gear was nowhere to be seen. He'd been robbed. Someone at the campground had stabbed my best friend and then stolen our fishing gear. I actually ended up blurting out that the gear was gone and that I think he was robbed, and the police seemed to agree with my assumption. The officers told us that they would be sweeping the area, but they let us go with Alex to the hospital, thankfully. They got him stabilized in the ambulance, and we had to take the 20 or so minute trip to the nearest hospital. I just remember staring at Alex as he lay unconscious on that stretcher. He did survive the attack. They hadn't hit anything vital. He was at the hospital for several days while they made sure nothing internally had been damaged, and they got him all fixed up. His dad and I had to get a ride back to the campground, and we packed everything up. Camping wasn't exactly sounding like a good time anymore. It's crazy to me that on this simple camping trip, something so terrible could happen so randomly. Alex wasn't a threatening kid. He was 13 and weighed nothing. He was smaller than me at the time. If this person wanted the gear, they didn't have to go to such lengths. He would have just given it up. I know him. When he was finally stable and mentally awake enough to explain things, he basically told the exact thing that I assumed. He was walking to the fishing spot when he heard someone shout at him. He thought it was me at first, so he stopped and turned around, but the second he turned around, there was a knife going into his abdomen. He didn't get a good look at the person because all he could focus on was the pain of getting stabbed. He remembered feeling it, grabbing the spot and just falling over, and watching as this person grabbed the gear and walked off. In the end, it was a case of wrong place, wrong time. Of course, I have those thoughts that if I had been with him, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I can't dwell on that too much. This person was clearly willing to just straight up stab someone for like $50 worth of tackle, so they would have probably done the same thing either way. We never went camping again, and Alex ended up with a gnarly scar and a story to tell when we got back to school. They never caught the person that was responsible for it. They did the full search, and they never found anyone. Obviously, the psychological scars of seeing my best friend lying on the ground bleeding like that, they really messed with me. But I try to not let it haunt me too much since he did make it. Alex and I are still pals with our own lives, though neither of us has chosen to go out camping since that incident. I've been sitting on this story that I had actually forgotten about until my cousin reminded me of what happened. He and I were chatting. We were at my aunt's house for my grandmother's 94th birthday, and he asked me, "Yo, Nate, you remember that time we found a cabin in the woods?" And it all came flooding back to me in an instant. This was back when we were in our early 20s, which was in the early 2000s, and we used to go places and do some urban exploration, which is just a fancy way of saying breaking and entering. It was a day in the late spring, and we had decided to spend our Saturday going to an area that had an abandoned school near a really small town that barely even has a Dollar General store. We knew that this school was there because a friend of my cousin's likes to scout out these kind of areas too, and he told my cousin about it. We started out on our hike. The weather was warm, but it was definitely overcast, looking like a storm was going to hit in a few hours. But we didn't plan to be out all day. We found the school, did our expedition, and I may write a story about how creepy that was, but it was actually what we found after that this story is about. We followed a path off the back end of the school, and we walked it for a solid half hour until we wound up finding what was pretty clearly an old abandoned cabin. This cabin was decrepit and nestled between a group of trees that had taken the area back over. The structure was pretty rough, though the windows were all still mostly intact. We approached slowly, just in case there was someone that was still living there, and stranger things have happened. But as we approached, we noticed that the door was slightly open, and that the cabin was definitely vacant. We pushed the door open, and it immediately stirred up a layer of dust that caused me to pull my shirt over my nose. The inside was as run down as the outside suggested. It was musty, damp, it smelled like mold, but there was still furniture that was set up in the living room, albeit gray from the dirt that had settled. We began looking around, the floorboards all creaking under our weight. I was honestly thinking that the whole thing might collapse, and that we were going to end up trapped in the rubble. My cousin, on the other hand, was way more interested in touring this place, and didn't even acknowledge my concerns. We looked over the furniture in the living room and came to a conclusion that the couch was definitely hand-carved, with the cushions that were hand-sewn and put together. We got to the bookshelf, and it was filled with moldy books. Most of them just old literature, but I noticed that there were a few books that were based around, well, Satanism. I don't mean just books about the devil. I mean that there were a handful of books that were written to explain the significance of rituals, how to properly sacrifice animals. I mentioned this to my cousin, and he thought it was really interesting. We kind of glanced over the books, but he ended up putting them back on the shelf. I mentioned that we could take one of them for the hell of it, but my cousin said that doing so would just be inviting evil spirits into our lives. I didn't question him on that. We noticed that there were a set of stairs that went up to a loft, and another set that went down into what we assumed was a cellar or a basement. But we decided to check out this floor first. We moved on to the kitchen, and that's when the really weird stuff happened. In the sink, there were what looked like bones. Small, fragmented, broken, and worst of all, wet. They weren't covered in blood or anything, but they were wet like they'd been recently washed. We opted to just leave them as they were and move on. On the counter was a pile of old newspapers from the nearby town, and even a larger town that was a few miles away. These newspapers were a solid decade old, but what was really weird is that most of them were just the front page and the obituaries, with people and names circled. My obvious first thought was that maybe this was some kind of serial killer circling the obituaries for his victims, but as I looked at them, these people were all born the same year, and it was a long time ago, which made me think that this was someone tracking a group of people they knew and circling them as they passed. We pressed on further, deciding to check out the back half of the cabin, but there really wasn't much to it. There was what looked like a bedroom that was mostly empty, and the bathroom was pretty dirty and messed up. After this, my cousin asked if I wanted to go check out the loft, and then the basement. I agreed. We went back to the living room, and I stepped up the ladder and described what was up there. It was basically just a bed, and a small end table and a really small CRT TV. I looked around, trying to see if there was anything worth really looking at, when I decided to open up the end table. Now, I don't want to describe what I saw. I will just say that the drawer was filled with very graphic, very disturbing, and very illegal photographs. Among those were other photographs, voyeuristic pictures, of people that clearly didn't know they were being photographed. I told my cousin about what was in the drawer, and I could hear his disgust. He told me to come on back down and that we should just go check out the basement really quick. I didn't like that he was suggesting that we keep looking. We walked down the stairs toward the basement, which had a door at the bottom. My cousin slowly opened the door, and the second that it opened, the stench of decay flew out into the stairwell. I nearly threw up, and my cousin pulled the door shut and said, "Nope." We both ran up the stairs and out of the cabin. We stood outside and tried to figure out what we should do. Should we call the cops? The pictures, the smell of death? It made me think that there may have been something really messed up in there that we didn't see. My cousin was saying that he just wanted to move on. After talking it through for a few moments, we ended up deciding that we would just go ahead and forget that this place ever existed. Whatever happened in that place probably happened a long time ago, and there was nothing there that would help them find anything now. We never went back to that cabin. We never went back to that school, either. We both just kind of accepted that something terrible had happened in that little cabin in the woods, and there was likely someone or something dead in the basement. But we didn't want to know what. I feel like we probably should have told the police, but I don't really regret it. I have no idea if anyone else has ever found that cabin, though I'm sure somebody has by now. The experience was really not what was expected, but it was definitely creepy. Something happened to me a few years back that still gives me some chills to this day, but I've never really shared it with anyone. No real reason, I just don't like to think about it, and typing this out requires me to do so. If some of this sounds disjointed, I do apologize. I'm not a very good writer, but I'll try to give this as much detail as possible. Anyways, here goes. I was working a consulting gig in Texas back during the pandemic. It was remote, but I knew that at some point, I was going to have to drive to the main site to give the presentation that I found during my consultation. I've done this before with other clients, but this was my first on-site during the years of COVID, so I was a bit iffy on this whole trip anyways. But what happened really cemented that I should have just demanded a remote presentation. The night this happened, I was most of the way to my hotel, and I really didn't want to stop, as it was only about an hour or so to get there. But I was also feeling nervous as the roads that I was driving were incredibly empty and remote. I was driving feeling like I was going to hit a wall soon, and I noticed that Google Maps showed an alternate route to the hotel from where I was. That was even more rural, but was about 10 minutes quicker. I quickly hit the button and made the next turn to take that route instead. The roads were incredibly empty and dark, pretty much just a random strip of asphalt that cut through the Texan wilderness. A couple of minutes down this road, I spotted what looked like a figure on the side of the road. I slowed down a bit and noticed that it was a woman, frantically waving her arms in the glow of my headlights. I could feel my heart rate increasing as I stopped to see if she was okay. I really didn't want to, but I couldn't have lived with myself if something happened, and I could have helped her. She was middle-aged, her hair was a wild mess, and her eyes were wide with panic. She immediately started babbling a mile a minute, frantically screaming about anything and everything, until she finally stopped, took a deep breath, and said that she had just been in a car crash. She followed that up with sobs, saying that she had driven off the road, that she'd somehow flipped her car and that her husband was still trapped inside, and she needed my help. The story was believable, but something about it still seemed off. She had some bruises on her face, but other than that, she just looked pretty well untouched. She didn't have any cuts, her clothes weren't torn or dirty, and she didn't look too injured. Though I will say that adrenaline can do some wild things. I also didn't see a car behind her, but if she had driven off the road and flipped it, it could have been deeper into the woods. I started asking her some questions to gather more information, trying to piece together the situation. She was cagey with details, first saying that she had fallen asleep and veered off the road. I mentioned that I could call 911 for her and wait until they showed up, but she cut me off. However, this is where she slipped up, saying, "Please, hurry! My son really needs help. He's still trapped down there." I froze. She'd said her husband was trapped, not her son. Sensing that something was off, I made a split-second decision. I looked at my phone and said, "I don't have a good enough signal to call 911 right here. Let me drive a bit further down the road to make the call." She became frantic when I said this, urging me to come with her, getting to the point that her sobbing became an angry screaming at me to get out of the car. I shifted back into drive and started down the road, hitting the gas pedal as quickly as I could. I could hear her continuing her screams as I watched her waving her arms at me in the rear view. About 20 feet down the road, a man then jumped out of the tree line. I watched him jump out and hurl something at my car, which was followed by a sickening thud and a shattering sound. A brick, what I'm assuming is what he threw, had smashed into my windshield, sticking into the glass but not breaking through it. I slammed on the gas, freaking out and realizing that this whole thing was a massive setup that I almost fell for. I looked back again and saw the two people in the middle of the road arguing with each other and making very aggressive motions towards each other in the direction that I was going. The rest of that drive was an honest blur. I was in shock, shaking and sweating, the brick just sitting there in my windshield, blocking the right half of my vision. I got to the hotel, which was about 30 minutes away from where I was, and I asked the front desk to call the authorities. I just sat in the lobby chair breathing heavily and thinking about what happened. They took my statement and promised to check it out, but as far as I know, they never found anything. They did call me in the morning and told me that they found a spot on the road that I'd mentioned where there was a lot of broken glass, but there was nobody anywhere nearby. Obviously, that trip was a bit stressful, as I was 3 states away from home in my personal car with a now shattered windshield, and I still had to give my presentation. I did give the presentation, and I actually mentioned what happened, and thankfully the client was willing to give me a little bit of wiggle room, considering my stress levels. I had the windshield replaced in Texas. Thankfully, my insurance was willing to cover it since they had a police report number, and the report did explain things pretty well. I've since pushed all my clients to do remote presentations, and thankfully they've mostly been okay with it, including the extra work that I've done for that same client down in Texas. Regardless, I will never drive through those empty parts of Texas at night, ever again. Hey Raven, it's Ollie from some of your other stories. It was 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. Me and my friends were going cycling to a neighboring town. However, we switched plans and decided to go on an aimless cycle. We cycled along the highway and then some streets, and then a road. We were miles from home. Having the Chili Peppers playing in your ears as you cycle aimlessly is honestly pretty great. Eventually, the town that we were in started to get less and less urban, until we were just cycling along a farm road with no buildings to be seen for miles. At some point, we saw a town come into view. We could see the entire town from where we were, so we knew it was small. And it definitely was. There were no cars driving about, despite the countless cars parked outside houses. We got into the town and realized that every single shop was closed. There were quite a few, for how small the town was. In their defense, it was a Sunday. The center of town was nothing more than a small monument for someone that I'd never heard of, nor can remember. It was already turning evening, and with it being January, it was already getting dark. I needed to eat something quick. My friends and I looked all over trying to find a place to eat. It might have just been paranoia, but honestly it felt like the few people that we did see around town were staring at us. They might have just been surprised to see new people in this crack shack of a town. Eventually we found a single open takeout. It was small and locally owned. Some of my friends decided that they would rather wait until they went home to eat than to eat here. Me and my friend who I'll simply call Charlie, stayed. The pizza that I ordered came quick. I guess it was probably just frozen. It was alright, nothing special. On the other hand, Charlie's kebab took at least 45 minutes. The girl at the counter only looked a couple of years older than us, but acted as if we were aliens or something. I kept glimpsing at her staring at me and then turning away quickly. By the time that we left the takeout, it was already dark. We were hungry, so we began eating right away. It was then that Charlie started complaining about the food. I've never been a huge fan of kebabs, but I still like them in some way. I asked to try it, and he let me. At first it was fine. Then, suddenly a horrible taste washed over my mouth. It was overly salty and yet sickly sweet. Was it the sauce? No, it had texture. I told Charlie that it was definitely just one ingredient that was ruining it. He agreed and started poking about the kebab. We both noticed what we knew was the strange ingredient at the same time. The meat? It was gray. And that's the best thing about it. It was thinly sliced into squares. It almost looked like beef jerky, only it hadn't been dried. We thought that there were green spots on it, but that could have just been the other ingredients on it. I decided to taste the meat on its own. Sure enough, it was what we had tasted. I spat it out, but there was no way of telling what meat that it was. Was it chicken crushed into a chicken foam? Beef? Pork? Who knows? All we know is that it tasted awful. The consistency was even worse. It was like Spam morphing into clay. Charlie threw it in the bin, and I shared my pizza with him. On the way back, we meet our friends, and I again noticed that everyone was staring at Charlie and I. We both wanted to leave. We got back with our friends, and they told us the same thing, that people had been giving them strange looks all day. We took our bikes from the rack that we had put them in, and we left. As we were leaving, the number of abandoned buildings began to dawn on me. I hadn't noticed that they were abandoned on the way into the town, but now I did. The streets were laid out strangely, with several uncomfortable turns and such. The roads were desolate, riddled with potholes. I was lucky that I had Google, otherwise I'd be completely lost. As I checked Google Maps, I realized how out of the way this town was. You could see on the map that there were several towns all connected by roads, but the town we were in was only connected by one single road leading to it, and nothing else. If you've ever seen the map of a town, you'll understand that this isn't normal by any means. We left the town and cycled down the road that we came. We slowly began making our way home, one by one leaving the group to cycle to our houses respectively. And that's about it. This event probably isn't as unsettling as the other ones I've submitted here, but it has confused me since. If I were to use one word to describe the town, it would be fake. Everything felt as if it was hiding something, even though it likely wasn't. So, quiet town on the country road, I don't think I'll be seeing you again any time soon. Well, friends, I hope that you enjoyed this collection of scary middle-of-nowhere stories. Stories that take place in seemingly the middle of nowhere. I have family that lives in the middle of nowhere, down in Random Place, Kansas. I technically also live in Random Place, Kansas. Albeit me living more on the suburban side of things, but anyways, I have family that lives in the middle of nowhere, and it's not bad. The stars are nice. Whenever there's no streetlights, the stars are really nice to stare at. And you can hear the wild animals at night, the howling of the wolves or coyotes or whatever. The weird sounds of the foxes that they make, those weird cackling noises, whatever. The random sounds of the wendigos as they trot through the forest trying to catch chickens. You know how it is. No, but seriously, it's a nice place. It's a nice area, being just out away from the city. Yeah. Though leaving at night is always creepy, because I guess it's just the fact there are no lights, and it's hard to tell where people are, or where the road is, and headlights can only do so much. Anyways, this was a good collection of scary middle of nowhere stories, and hopefully you all enjoyed them. If you did, please consider hitting that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing. If you feel ever so bold, you can go down below to the comment section and leave me a comment. That's right, I'm British now. To my British and UK fans, I am so sorry for what I just did. Anyways, I don't know why that happened. It just did. I'm kind of tired. It's the middle of the afternoon, but I'm just kind of sleepy. I had a heavy lunch. I had pizza. We got pizza. Why did we get pizza? Because I was craving pizza. And after eating it, I'm now crashing. But I had to finish this video, so there we go. Anyways, friends, I hope you're having a beautiful week, and I do hope that I see you again here very soon. Until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please do not forget it. And until I see you again, much love, and sleep well.